So my first experience is first I have to start off by saying that I'm a twin, which is sort of part of how I've always had that sort of competitiveness to me. So when I was just 6 years old, me and my twin brother, we were playing football twice a week for like the local club, just a bit of junior sports and that. And then eventually we ended up going to a local PCYC to work on some wrestling. Our dad did a bit of amateur wrestling back in the day, and he thought it'd be a good sort of base to help us with our football. Not so much that we were super into wrestling, but it's just a good skill to have, teach you how to control people, and it's really good for your sort of what you say, your tackles and everything in rugby league. Like that, it transfers very well. So we were mainly pursuing rugby league from about 6 to 13 years old. We're doing that. Made a few junior rep teams as a kid. Wasn't anything special or anything like that. And we're always wrestling at the same time. And I started to fall more in love with wrestling sort of thing. So every day would go wrestle and stuff like that. So then I eventually ended up starting to do my first competitions, and the competitions started. I started doing pretty well, even though the wrestling scene is still pretty small in Australia. There was still sort of would always have matches once a month, sort of thing. So I'd go to up to Sydney, down to Canberra, and would always compete. So since about 6 or 7, I was always in some sort of competitive one-on-one environment, as well as competitive team environments. And eventually, once I got to around 11, 12, I started not to like really the team environments anymore, purely because if there was a mistake made by someone else, I wasn't able to control that. Whereas if there was mistake made in a wrestling, I could at least analyze it, go back and fix it, sort of thing. So when I was 13, I said, enough of this. I had enough of footy. I'm about 45 kilos dripping wet, getting ran over by like 80-kilo kids, big time kids. Like, it wasn't fun for me anymore. I did well in wrestling. I won a few Australian titles, won state titles. So I had a decent little junior career in wrestling. And then at age 13, that was when I first went over to freestyle. It was freestyle fighting gym back then, but now it's freestyle MMA. And that's when I first came in contact with Joe Lopez. So I started there when I was 13. And I originally started with just the jiu-jitsu. I had very little interest in the striking that. I'm like, all I want to do, I just want to do jiu-jitsu. I think around that time, Kenan Cornelius was probably one of the biggest jiu-jitsu stars. So I'm like, oh, I want to get in again and sort of try and do what he does. So I started doing competitions, and I did my first ever competition when I was 14, I think. It was, yeah, 13 or 14 for jiu-jitsu, and I ended up driving around 2.5, 3 hours to Newcastle. My dad did. And I remember this kid tried to pull guard on me about the first 40 seconds, and I slammed him on the mat, and he started crying. So I put my hand up like, yes, I won my first match. Like, I love this sport. But then my ref DQ'd me, and I had like a mental breakdown. I started crying. And I remember going back in the car, and I'm like, fuck this jiu-jitsu stuff. Like, I'm over it. I don't want to do it anymore. Like, I just want to start. I don't want to hurt someone and get in trouble for it. And then Joe's like, explained the rules a bit more to me. He's like, just give me one more comp. Give me one more comp. We'll see how you go. Then I think for a month or two later, I ended up doing it was just a white belt comp, but I think it was the Australian titles when I was up in Sydney. Ended up getting second. So I won my first match by submission. I lost the final point. And as soon as I was hooked, I was like, oh, I know this jiu-jitsu thing's for me. So then I ended up knowing I couldn't do MMA until I was 18. I was like, I might as well pursue jiu-jitsu pretty passionately for the next sort of few years whilst I'm actually able to compete in it fairly regularly. So I was still going to high school and everything like that, but I was training 6 days a week. So every afternoon it was either wrestling or jiu-jitsu sort of thing. That was all done at Freestyle MMA. And then I went to Pan Pacs twice as a blue belt, won a few state titles and that. So I did all right for myself. And then as soon as I think I turned 17, that's when I sort of swapped my focus to MMA. And that's sort of how my MMA journey started. I was like, okay, I'm going to be 18 in a year. I need to start working on my striking so I can eventually get in the cage and perform. And then Joe had a show, chucked me on the show, had my first fight, and then it sort of just went from there.